Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Over the last decade or so, in what seems like all corners of the design world, there has been an interest in what sometimes gets classified as these sort of alternative design practices. I'm thinking about things like critical design or speculative design, design fiction, discursive design. I've covered many of these over the years on the show and have done countless episodes on and around their themes and their lessons. A lot of this interest, I'd argue, can be traced back specifically to the work of Anthony Dunne and Fiona Raby. There's a long history of critical design in the various design fields, and Dunne and Raby, through their projects, their books, and their teaching, helped popularize it for a new generation of designers and even took it further when they coined the term speculative design. I was excited when I saw that Dunne and Raby had a new book coming out this year, titled Not Here, Not Now, Speculative Thought, Impossibility, and the Design Imagination. This is their first book in about a decade, and I was curious to see what they were thinking about now. And then when I read it, I found this book fascinating. I found it fascinating because in some ways it felt like a continuation of the work they'd been doing, but I couldn't quite figure out how. At times it felt like a focusing of their work, wrestling with design's relationship to reality, a subject that's been the backbone of their practice since its inception. But at other times, it felt like a corrective, like a response to how their work has been seen by others over the last decade, a clarification of what they really want to say. The terms speculative design and critical design, for example, don't appear in this book at all. So I invited them on the show to talk about these ideas in this new book and how they may or may not be in dialogue with their previous work. Anthony Dunne and Fiona Raby are designers, educators, and authors who use design as a way to stimulate debate and discussion and challenge our relationship to reality through designed objects. For the last 10 years, they were university professors of design and social inquiry at the New School in New York City and co-directors of the Design Realities Studio, positions that they recently left. Before that, Tony was the director of the Design Interactions program at the RCA from 2005 to 2015. Fiona also taught in that program, as well as at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, where she was a professor of industrial design from 2011 to 2016. Alongside this academic work, they maintain a studio practice operating under the name Dunne and Raby, and along with their recent book, they've also published books Speculative Everything, Hertzian Tales, and Design Noir. In this conversation, I was really curious to talk to Tony and Fiona about this new book and how it builds upon speculative everything. We talk about their ongoing interest in reality and how design shapes that. We talk about the role of critique in their work, why they think their work is often misread, and why they don't like calling themselves speculative designers. It's a really great conversation that I think both surveys a landscape of a particular kind of design practice while also tracing the evolution of this particular practice. I really, really enjoyed this one. If you like this show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everybody, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview every month and helps keep this show free all the time. I hope this show feels like listening to a great conversation in a coffee shop. And so I like to think that for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work. You can help us have these conversations and have more of them in the world. Anthony Dunne and Fiona Raby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jared. We're delighted to be here. Thanks for having us.
So you have this new book, Not Here, Not Now, Speculative Thought, Impossibility, and the Design Imagination, that came out earlier this year. This shares the name Not Here, Not Now with a project that you did about 9 years ago, 2014, that was also called Not Here, Not Now, that was about sort of how fictions are represented through design. This is also your first book since 2013, Speculative Everything. And so I'm curious about that 9, 10, 11 year gap. You've been very busy in those 10 years. How did that project from 9 years ago turn into a book now in 2025?
Well, I guess it's one tiny little part of the new book, but I think the title has kind of hung around,
Mhm.
obviously, from that time. And I think very shortly after Speculative Everything came out, it sort of got tangled up intensely with the idea of design futures, which is something we talk about in the book, but it's just one part of the book.
Mhm.
And with that comes a whole pile of assumptions and baggage and other kinds of issues. And I think we already, even then, were thinking, well, actually, there's stuff about speculative thought in general that's getting lost even at that early stage. And so we wanted to think about how can we re-emphasize the critical
Mhm.
potential of speculative thinking and this idea of just it's just not here, it's not now, it's not a future, it's not a past, but it's definitely not the present. So it's this kind of space where you can think and question and challenge contemporary assumptions. So in a way, that project might have been a pivot where we started to try and move off in a related but a maybe deeper direction.
I want to read something to you. This is on the first page of the new book. You say the ideas in this book took shape during a time when, for us at least, what we thought of as reality, something stable, shared, and durable, began to feel like it was coming apart at the seams. How did that insight, how did that feeling that reality was now unstable, how did that change your approach to your work? How did that change how you were thinking about this idea of the not here, not now? Because I feel like that idea of reality probably felt a little more stable in 2014 when you were first thinking about these ideas.
I think COVID had a role to play in that,
Brexit.
and Brexit, but
Mm,
Brexit started, and
mm-hmm,
COVID. Those things changed our world completely.
I think that, obviously with futures and the more stable world maybe that we were talking about, they kind of unfold even imaginatively within a kind of fairly stable framework of economics and politics and so on. And I think with the crash, with Brexit, with COVID and other things, those frameworks themselves started to crumble or be challenged or reconceptualized and even implemented in different ways. And so it kind of made us think actually it's more interesting to think about the sort of frameworks that we use to
mm.
define things like what's possible and not, what's real and what's not. So it's sort of, yeah, it just slowly emerged as we found ourselves, like everyone else, carried along by these kinds of one wave after another.
But I think the other thing was technology. We were, 60s children, and we were going to go to the moon, and
Right.
the future was there, and all of that period was very much about the emerging technologies, what they're going to bring to us, and suddenly I think those technologies were then starting to kind of produce kind of difficulties and problems, and suddenly they were being worn away.
Yeah.
I think that was another kind of crucial. We didn't believe in that technology anymore. Was it going to make everything better? I think that was a
Yeah.
key moment too.
I think there is another aspect that all through our careers we've grappled with things being real and unreal. Even as students, our work was critified for not being realistic or not being real. And so I think when reality itself, from our perspective, started to be shaken, it kind of made us think, well, hang on, maybe we need to look at this a little bit more deeply. And that's when we started to look at things like quantum physics and certain aspects of philosophy and areas where people have been thinking about this sort of stuff way more deeply than we generally would in design for much longer. Whereas in design, we tend to accept, this is what reality is. Let's work within it.
Yeah, I actually, after I read the new book, I went back and I reread Speculative Everything. It was the first time I read it cover to cover, maybe since it came out, at least in 10 years. And I was so surprised by how often in that book you refer to reality also. And maybe that's because I had read the new book, but it really stood out to me how much that book was also about this question of reality and unreality. You write on page 2 of Speculative Everything, design speculations can act as a catalyst for collectively redefining our relationship to reality. And I read that, I was like, oh, that could have come out of the new book. I want to you used this idea of impossibility or what is possible or not possible, and Something I was thinking about as I was reading the new book, in a shift that I felt in the new book and the new ideas, is what that line is of impossibility has moved, and how much you want to push those ideas of impossibility. And so I think in an unstable reality, you could either go more possible, you could make things that are more direct, you could wrestle with ideas and make them as realistic, as direct, as, clear as possible, or you could go the other way. You could make it more impossible. You could make it more conceptual. You could make it more outside of our realm. And it seems to me that you've gone the second way, that your work has gotten more interested in the impossibilities, more interested in the conceptual, more interested in the impossible. Does that sound right to you? Does that trajectory sound?
Definitely. I think we've always been interested in that side of things. And as you say, in speculative everything, it kind of pops up throughout. And in fact, we wrote a preface for the new paperback edition about a year ago. And I think one of the things we said was, originally we thought speculative everything was about fiction, but maybe actually it's about reality.
Yeah.
And along the lines that you're talking about. But I think also another part of our identity is we're academics and researchers. So if there's a lot and lots of work being done into how to make things possible, how to solve problems, how to move forward, we're kind of looking for, well, where is the gaps in our knowledge and understanding? And what can we then do to maybe take advantage of our privileges working in an academic environment to delve into those ideas and bring them into the kind of broader design conversation.
But we're doing that as practitioners.
True practice in an academic context.
I think that viewpoint from a practitioner's point of view is really important. We're not just academics from a theoretical point of view. Is this space between the two? And I also think that within practice, there are whole different sets of languages that just aren't addressed, that aren't represented within theoretical discourse at all, or that it's very, very separate. So I think for us, this moment where these two things can come together, I mean, in some ways we think of the work as being sort of like models, and that not, this thing about prototypes and models, which what do we produce as practitioners? Are they three-dimensional essays that we produce? Is each piece of work?
Yeah.
But the language is not in an essay format.
Right.
So I like to think of the work as sort of sitting alongside of a theoretical position.
I think the other thing is that sometimes, and again, this is when speculation gets tangled up with futures, there's a sense that it must be possible in some way. Its value is it can be realized, even if people won't realize it for political or economic reasons. And this kind of boundary of the impossible is seen as worthless or a waste of time. And I think in the times we're living in now, it shows how what was impossible a few years ago is suddenly possible, and these reversals.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's important, especially in education, to embrace the impossible, not in a fantastical kind of escapist way, but to say these kinds of notions shift over time, and we shouldn't just dismiss things because they feel impossible now, but engage with that. And maybe by embracing more fully the impossible, we're saying, look, there's no way this is going to be realized, and that's fine.
Yes.
But it serves these other purposes. It helps us think about stuff. So it's kind of untangling a little bit. Is the value of these ideas that they could be realized, and that's what makes them, or we're trying to say, no, the value is they can never be realized, but they help us think about things differently and shift our mindsets.
To me, a nice kind of summation of the argument in this new book was in the 4th chapter, Unreal by Design. And you're talking about a project from somebody else. The project is For the Rest of Us by Hank Beyer and Alex Sizemore. And you write of their work, they're not trying to show us what our world would look like if we embraced these values, but instead hint at worlds that open the viewer's mind to different possibilities and values. That feels like a subtle difference to me from showing how using design to show what the world could look like if we embrace these values versus just showing that another world is possible. Tell me about that separation, because that feels key to unlocking how you think about your work, honestly.
It
It's
is.
absolutely spot on, I
Yeah,
think.
you're choosing some very nice quotes, and helpful quotes for us too.
Hey,
Um,
that's what
yes,
I'm
this
here
is a
for.
really important point. I think that's the thing that sometimes, again, with I keep going back to futures because it has
Yeah.
been quite frustrating. It's if you say it, the fact you've proposed this future, it must be that your intention is somehow to realize it or to maybe even impose it on other people. Whereas for us, these even future visions are meant to be catalysts to
Hmm.
sort of spark further thought, further imagining that hopefully go beyond the kinds of ideas that we propose. So yes, in this book, we're trying to be more explicit that, again, because of the kind of crazy times we're living in and the uncertainty we're immersed in, we can't really plot paths forward, but maybe
Yeah.
we can catalyze new types of thinking, imagining, and designing. And somewhere, new pathways will begin to emerge. So, in that sense, we're seeing design maybe in a much more modest and humble role
Mm,
of trying to catalyze and open up possibilities rather than say, oh, here's a future we figured out. And not that we ever did that, but sometimes that happens. People say, here's a future.
right.
Now let's all get behind it and try and make it happen.
I also think that some, within our practice, we always tend to have collections of things. It's not like
Yeah.
one object that represents the whole project.
Yeah.
And that's also because I think there are multiple ways of thinking about the space. So we look at a space and then there are multiple, oh, it could be like this or it could be like that. Or, there's never a resolution of one thing. And we put those things on the table and there are multiple ways of then thinking about that particular idea through
Yeah.
objects, through the
But
objects that we create.
I think the other projects, including that one in that section, are sort of impossibilities. That the designers are working with the fact they know these things aren't realistic, and they're meant to operate on our minds differently, not show us a way forward, but
Yeah.
excite and stimulate the imagination. I think there's a whole set of aesthetic ideas that are related to that that might be more familiar in fine art and architecture, that in 3D design, especially the more industrial side of it, haven't really been explored in the same way.
This might be a reductive question, but you've mentioned a couple times, or at least I'm hearing in your voice a little bit, frustration with the way your work has gotten tied up with this idea of futures design, design fiction, speculation as something to come. Um, I've heard you talk in interviews over the last couple of years that you found the future to be limiting as a framing device, especially with students, that it's actually not as productive as maybe it used to be, or that it could be. Fiona, you mentioned earlier that there's this sort of like kind of capitalist industry capture of the future. Also, can you tell me a little bit more about why the future ha- is not as productive a space to be thinking as it once was? Or just talk me through that feeling a little more directly about why the future isn't the only way that you can kind of do this work. Do you know what I'm trying to ask there?
I think maybe it's again going back to our role as researchers.
Mm,
And there's plenty of work, and historically, there's plenty of work done on futures thinking, futures thought, and where design and futures meet. And it's not that we're against it, it's there
right.
and it's doing really important work, and it's kind of pretty well understood. And I think, again, we're trying to look at what other kind of related activities design can do that maybe futures can't do. And this is where I think it's important to emphasize this is very much about what we do rather than
Hmm.
trying to generalize and saying all designers should be doing this or thinking about
Right.
that. And particularly within the context of education, I think students, when they start working with futures, again, get into this mindset that a future must be implemented at some point or implementable to be valuable. And in a learning environment, we want the students to think more freely about alternative possibilities and then figure out what can we do with these, what usefulness they have, and so on. So it's kind of letting go of some of the baggage that comes along with futures thinking to
Yeah.
unlock some of the potential of just speculative thought in general. So it's not as, I want to be clear, it's not really, we're not anti
Right.
futures.
Right. No, I
In the
understand.
work we're doing, we find there are limitations on it. And so we've tried to find other ways of working in that space that maybe open up new
Yeah.
possibilities.
It's too much baggage within that world. As soon as you talk about futures, a whole lot of visual and imagery, and suddenly it's you're completely colonized with ideas of what that's supposed to be. And I think one of the things I think later in the book, there's an exercise that we use. It's like, how do we unlock different kinds of visual experimentation. How do we unlock the unknown? What don't we know? I think that's the thing that we constantly say to the students. If they're putting things on the table that we all already know, why are we even looking at that? How do we unlock something we don't know? And we want to look at that from an aesthetic dimension, and we think that the sort of materiality and the kind of visual languages can actually tell you things that sometimes saying those things, just saying those things, they're already kind of locked into something we already know. So I think coming up with something, we encourage our students to make from day one, and try and think and make at the same time, partly because when they're making something and they're playing with materiality that's not expected, we're always looking for the unexpected. We're good at storytelling. We can constantly make something into a story, make it logical. But how do we start from these illogical things, these unknown things? How do we make that leap into this space? And that's really difficult
How
to
do you do that? Yeah. Tell me how you do that?
I think it's really tough. We do a kind of intensive week where we really try, and with books, actually, without the internet, we've got a whole range of books which are very specific visual material, which are challenging ways that we visual representation, and we immerse ourselves for the first week, and we have stories that we are that are sort of odd and strange and don't make sense, and we live with those, and we try and hold on to that before we leap into the 1 week test where they have to kind of make something of it. But the thing is that we always snap back to reality, and so we know. So it's not easy. I don't think it's easy at all.
Well, what we do is the students would bring an interest to the class. It can be about sustainability, poetics, or different things. And then we ask them at the end of the week to provide a glimpse into a world where there's a very different way of understanding the concepts that they started with. And then for the semester, they develop and unpack those. But it is amazing how again and again and again, you try and ask, well, how do we get from here to there? And then it all kind of collapses back into fairly familiar ideas.
Yeah.
And trying to say, look, we're temporarily in the not here, not now for 15 weeks. It's okay. It doesn't make sense. Let's just it's so hard. Even for us too. We keep coming back and applying existing frameworks to the ideas.
But that's why not here, not now is a really useful thing. We keep saying, well, that's here and now, how do we get to and so for us, it's a tool.
Sounds very simple.
Simplicity in the class, because it's a really good way of kind of just saying, well, because immediately if you've got an idea and it already exists, it's already here.
Or it makes sense in the here and now.
It makes sense here now.
Yeah.
So I think the tool we use, it's actually a very, very kind of important tool.
And sometimes students worry, if they go through this door, they're escaping reality. And I think we talk about it as a kind of a temporary occupation. They just spend a few weeks in this space, and then whatever transformation has happened to their thinking in that time, they bring that shift in perspective back to their work. So again, rather than the output being the most important thing, a vision, for example, it's the understanding of how you think about the present, the not here, not now, and so on.
Trying to think outside of our existing frameworks.
And then you bring that shift in your perspective back and carry on trying to work in your field.
Oh, that's really interesting. This is a series. You've set up a series of things that I was very curious to hear you talk about there, because I was curious about this process of research, investigation, storytelling, like say fiction making, and its relationship to the artifact, to the object. In making the object, does that then become real? Does it become here and now? And I was kind of curious, like how you go back and forth, and how you encourage students to go back and forth from the kind of the research and the reading, the ideas, the theories to the making. And what I'm hearing you say is that the object, the thing, the series of objects is actually the value that it gives is not that it is now an object, but that it is a manifestation of that process that you went through to get to the object. It's actually about that process than the thing itself. Does that sound right?
Yeah,
Yes and no.
it's
Yes
kind of
and
it's very much that the value is it's a physical thing in the here and now. So it kind of
Right.
exists along with all the other things around us, but it doesn't really belong. The ideas that
Ah,
informed its
yes.
development or the values that are embodied in it belong to maybe a different system of thought or an imagined reality or another moment in time. And that tension for us is the valuable thing. That's what
Hmm.
sparks
I see.
the next wave of thought or reflection. I think even if those objects are in a classic setting where visitors to an exhibition encounter them, then that's a different way of interacting with an exhibition. And it's definitely not a familiar way. People tend to look at the biography of the designer, the
Yeah.
historical framework, and so on. So I think it also requires a different way of looking at objects and trying to read them and understand them differently, especially historical things.
That was exactly what my next question was going to be. And I was afraid to ask you this question, honestly, because I was afraid it was going to be too reductive. But I'm wondering how you talk to me about how you, and you can apply this to the classroom if you want, how you critique this work. I feel like, if you critique it, if you talk about it aesthetically, does that just become an art object? If you talk about it functionally, does it just become kind of the default design as problem solving? There's something in the middle there that seems like how you have to kind of discuss whether the work is doing the thing that the creator
Yeah,
wants it to do. How do you do that? How do you lead those discussions in a classroom? That's a very
yeah,
educator question, but
yeah. It is. It's a bit loose and messy, I'd say, in reality. But I think some of the things are: is it helping us think new thoughts and kind of move away from the
mm,
familiar? And when we encounter the object visually, I think there should be a level of estrangement. It's kind of immediately feels odd or not quite
yeah,
right, or it doesn't sit in the existing world comfortably. So there is an aesthetic dimension and kind of signaling that these things don't really belong,
right.
even though they're physically present. And then there's the work the ideas do. Is it actually, are we just saying, is it taking our minds down familiar pathways, or is it jolting us into thinking differently?
Ah,
Now that sounds, neat and straightforward. In reality, obviously, it's a lot more complicated and messy. But I think they're the kind of things that we try to grapple with in
And
the
the
discussions.
other thing is that in the classes, our classes across the university. So the whole point is that we're a
right.
cross-disciplinary group, and we make the groups of the student. There's a sort of an application process only so that we can have diverse backgrounds in the room. So in some ways, it's some ways most projects are discussed collectively and
Yeah.
we all kind of like because different disciplines will have different amounts of reality.
Hmm.
If you've got a fiction writer, then unreality isn't easy for them.
Hmm.
It's not a
Yeah.
problem. If you've got an industrial designer, they're going to struggle with stepping outside of the physical.
Right.
And fashion is a whole. They've got
Yeah.
again their idea of reality is even bigger unreality. So I think what happens is we tend to let let the collective participate in that process to sort of say, well, is that an idea that's, we also got legs? And if
Yeah.
everyone gets excited by the idea, then everyone knows that, okay, that's
That
resonating
makes
with
sense.
multiple people in the room. It's not just it's not just us that does these things. It's definitely a collective, and we love that because we had a photography students one year, and we'd never had photography students,
Uh-huh.
and the pace was so slow. It's like they worked on one tiny bit of an image for a whole 15 weeks. And it was like, and it was so fascinating to look at something in such detail. And meanwhile, another student of fashion might be coming through, 10 ideas a week, So,
Yeah.
so I think that is another way in which I think that decisions happen collectively.
I want to come back to the makeup of your classes in a second, but I want to stay on this thread of critique for a second because this is making me think of something slightly related. Um, and I'm curious about the evolution of your thinking here because to go back to speculative everything just for a second, you talk a lot about this type of work as being a form of critique itself. And specifically, you talk a lot about it being a critique of design, being a critique of how we talk about design, of design practice, of design industry. Do you think your work is still a critique? Does that still resonate with you? And if so, what is it? What do you think it's critiquing now?
I don't know, actually.
I think maybe the critique is maybe more explicit in the fact we exist, it exists, and you shouldn't in the current environment.
Yeah.
And so by just continuing, I think, to try and design in ways that go against the grain, that to me at least is its critical function, rather than saying let's zoom in. Like a lot of the work we did in design interactions at the RCA was we'd look at some science research, try and imagine some of the implications that might come if that was ever to be implemented in the world, and then sometimes take a critical approach and try and manifest that in the design to shine a spotlight on that and other kind of related issues. So there was a very specific subject that was being critiqued, and in our own work at that time we were critiquing design itself. But I think now maybe it is just more embedded. Doing this stuff is a critical act.
Yeah, because we don't fit. I mean, this stuff, as you say, doesn't fit any category. I don't know where it sits. We're just kind of sort of little flag in the landscape of design. So where does it fit? I think that's I think that's the critique, but it does exist.
Having said that, we just did this project recently about the more than human. Yeah. And the starting point in a way was being quite critical of how those ideas are playing out in design, and wondering, in our kind of freer space of working in an academic setting, could we introduce maybe different perspectives of that? So it's not like a blunt attack or critique of a way of thinking, but it's starting with a set of critical observations, and then using that to move off. And hopefully the work then embodies a set of ideas that are an implicit critique, but also offer different ways of thinking about this stuff within the context of design.
That was coming from a historical perspective in some ways, wasn't it? That we kind of found the Oaks Hill piece that sort of, enabled us to look very differently, and thought, this is a very different way of thinking about the non-human. So we sort of used that.
Yeah, I mean, you were kind of joking when you were like, the fact that you exist is the critique, but I actually think there's something to that, and this idea of like not fitting. The implicit critique there is that this is the not here, not now. There are other ways to do things. There are other ways to approach something, and that almost feels like the critique, maybe, that this is actually about imagination or storytelling or thinking in a different way. And it's subtle, but just the fact that there is a type of practice that doesn't exist anywhere else, becomes the critique, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's because design maybe related to industry and technology, as opposed to furniture, other kinds of 3D design, is relatively new and still finding its way. And that's why it's quite exciting to be working in this field, because there are things to discover and to critique and explore and expand. So yeah, I think it's true. I mean, one of our biggest critiques would be the limitations design places on itself, and how can we push against those and expand what's possible. And it's happened, I think, in other fields, but in our kind of small corner of design, and particularly in education, and particularly at this moment, putting those kinds of limitations on how a younger generation is thinking about what's possible in the world, and how they would like to live differently, and what design could be.
Well, speaking about the self-imposed limitations of design, especially in education, I think this is a great way to kind of talk about your work over the last 10 years. So you were at the New School. You just announced that you're leaving that. About 9 years running something called the Design Realities Lab, that is described as a research and teaching platform working across the New School that combines design with social thought and the liberal arts. That to me seems very different than what you were doing at the RCA, doing design interactions, which was very much rooted in a design program. You're not in Parsons. You're not specifically in the School of Design. You're at the New School. I just had Joel Towers, the president, on the show a couple of weeks ago. Tell me about how that has changed your work or how you think about the possibilities of your work, not being rooted specifically in a design school, not only teaching designers or future designers, the diversity of student types in the class, the fact that again, you don't fit anywhere, you're in between the university. How did this change your approach to your work?
Had a huge impact.
Yeah, there's lots to say there. It's hard to pick out some. I think one thing is, if we start very practically, just the makeup of the class, that you have a fashion designer, a photographer, industrial product, but you also might have an anthropologist, a creative writer, a political scientist. And so just the presence of those different perspectives means that design ideas are going to evolve, and they're going to evolve differently, and the conversations are going to be different. And I think it's helped us move towards showing in a way how design can become a form of inquiry when you're surrounded by these other disciplines where that's more common.
Yeah.
But then with the other disciplines, say you have someone from political science, it's very focused on critiquing, analyzing, and describing existing realities and issues. The classes give them kind of permission to speculate and draw from a depth of knowledge that I don't think any designer or very few designers would have about those kinds of concepts, and then begin to imagine how things could be different. And rather than saying, oh, we're going to turn you into a designer in 15 weeks, they work with their existing concept, their tools as a political scientist. So they might write or deal with legal documents or constitutions or tell a story. So I think it's kind of expanded our understanding of how design can facilitate speculation in different fields in ways that might not be possible within those disciplines for very good reasons, I think. And then the other thing I think it's done is it's helped us understand that, when we were in London and also Vienna, we both ran departments. And you're kind of responsible for the whole kind of, what happens to the students when they leave.
Yeah, I get that. I'm there.
I think what's interesting with a class, which is what we do here, because that's the way the kind of US system works, is you can kind of go into some depth into the subject you're exploring, and students kind of knowingly sign up for that. And then they can kind of weave that back into their fashion studies or their work as industrial designers or whatever. And so it kind of has freed us up a little bit to treat our classes as research labs, to go much deeper with a whole set of very enthusiastic and capable students to explore a set of ideas. And that's been very nice, I think.
We also say to them, if that when they come into the class, they should do something that they can't do in their regular studies. If they're a tiny and not a huge thing, they could take a tiny piece of their project and bring it in and do something that they wouldn't feel, they stretch that envelope that little bit more. And so that's kind of a key kind of thing. But in terms of the diversity of it's been incredible. We've also co-taught with
I saw that.
And that's been incredible to literally co-teach with a political scientist, with an anthropologist, with a social scientist, with a media theorist, philosopher. To co-teach classes is
a real privilege.
It's a real.
I mean, to be able to do that and have more than one professor in a class, and I think that's one of the unique things about the new school is it really does try to commit to creating pockets of those kinds of activities, even though they don't make sense, within the normal kind of forces driving. Yeah. So for us, they've been some of the biggest learning experiences and the most uncomfortable, in a good way. When you're literally combining a studio class with a seminar class, but as designers, we're not doing the seminar. The seminar's been led by people who've done this as long as we have and know what they're doing. And so you're attracting students from both. Like if a student from anthropology comes into one of our design classes, they're kind of entering into the design space. But when we co-teach, you're really hybridizing the whole environment intellectually, educationally, and the students are genuinely experiencing a fusion of different styles of learning and discussion and discourse, and so are we.
Yeah. You're a student too in that.
Yes, yes. And not just in the subject matter, but in how you teach differently and how you manage this environment so that the students can get the most learning out of it from all these disciplines. So I think that's been a fantastic experience of working here.
and definitely opened up our imagination. I think the
Yeah,
book reflects that. I
yeah.
think this idea that we've wandered off into other disciplines to see how they think about reality, and then not gone into their world, but bring them back into and see, can we use this within a design framework? Is that useful or not? How did people, and just show how design can expand its boundaries a little. We're not saying let's just go off and all do these other
Right.
things. Let's just expand a little bit more and make this a richer space.
I think that comes through in the book. I think you're right that this book in many ways feels like an expansion of your thinking. I think a little bit it feels like a corrective of the way your work has been misinterpreted, as we've talked about in this conversation. I think it highlights the evolution. But one thing that I think hasn't changed over your career is your and tell me if you disagree with this, your kind of firm belief that your work is rooted in design. You seem, you know,
Our delusion.
okay. Well, I've heard you in interviews say, like, your work is not art. You've been very clear that you don't want this to be seen as art. Even in talking about co-teaching, you talk about they're entering a design space. This is a design class. You're bringing a design perspective. Why is it important that design is kind of the home base for all of that work? What does that space give you?
I don't know, to be honest. At this point, we go, yeah, maybe we should just describe ourselves as artists where design is our subject, and it'd be a lot
Oh, I
easier.
like that. Yeah.
We might
Then you
do.
would fit. You'd have a spot.
We might end up doing that.
Yeah.
But I think more seriously, I think it is going back to this idea of trying to expand
Yeah.
design practice, and especially in an educational environment where there should be less constraints. Of course, if you're working in industry or as a design studio, there's all sorts of constraints impact your practice. But in an environment where it's supposed to be about generating new ideas, new knowledge, new forms of practice, and disseminating those and testing those, I think for us it's important to say our platform for doing that is design, this subject area that we're both extremely passionate about, even though we're also very critical of. So it's kind of more of that, really. It's not about us. Oh, what would be the the easiest way to exist in the world and practice? It's more we genuinely find it interesting to think about design and its
Yeah.
limitations, how we can push against those, and design students find it very exciting and stimulating too.
But should economy be the only thing that shapes design?
Right.
Solution. There are multiple. I guess it comes back to this thing again about these multiple ways of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that comes through now more than ever, that there are multiple now. There isn't one Western way of being in
Mm-hmm.
the world,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if we live in multicultural cities, there are multiple ways and multiple ways of being, not just within our cultures but within our imaginations. And the richness, it seems to get kind of flattened out. Media, on one level, media makes things kind of extreme again, but I do think on the level of the objects language of the things that we have in the world, they're still so limited within domestic, or not even the domestic, the things that we could think about that's happening within our contemporary world, we that could exist. And by making an object, and this is the other thing I think which is quite interesting, is if do we just draw it or do we make it? So it's always from day one we were told, this is lovely, that you're never going to sell this, should it just stay in a book, or should you make it real? The minute you make it real, it's in the world, it's
Yeah.
here as a physical thing, but it doesn't belong, as we were talking
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
It has this other dimension to it.
Placebo project.
See,
We did this project in around 2000 called the Placebo.
Oh, yeah.
It's in the book Design Noir, where we designed these physical pieces of furniture that and reacted to electromagnetic fields in the home differently. And people lived with the objects for a few months, and we interviewed them,
and a different
gathered
take
them all
on
together.
objects.
And they were quite simple pieces. And afterwards, we took them to various manufacturers to see if we could make them.
Right.
And large and small. And they also, well, there's no market for these things. That was their
Right.
response.
Right.
And it kind
Who's
of,
gonna
in a
make
sense, they're
this?
not real. And I think that was another one of these hinges where we thought, okay, well, we're not going to give up, but we're not, maybe to continue doing this kind of design that doesn't fit the reality at that time of mass production and so on, we could shift it into the academic environment and continue to do a kind of design practice that maybe doesn't make commercial sense, but makes a different kind of sense and would hopefully have some value and usefulness in that context. And I guess that's how, in one way that kind of direction began.
And robots was another one. We robots were going in certain
Right.
directions, were technological, they were disappearing into the walls, and yet robotness,
Yeah.
that robots could be all sorts of really interesting things, from appliance things that just live with you and do different things, or they don't have to all be cute and look at you, or there could be multiple ways. And yet still I think the robotness and what that could be is still an interesting area aesthetically to explore.
I think
Yeah.
that won't happen so much in engineering
Right.
colleges. It doesn't happen so much in industry. So art schools
Yeah.
are still places where these kinds of things can be explored, even if they can't be implemented.
I mean, I asked a similar question to the curator Hans Ulrich Obrist earlier this year when he was on the show about sort of the way he's moved through different worlds, and he talked about something that's I was reminded of when you were talking, where it's like the art world is his home base, and so he can take the ideas from the art world and then go give it to those other worlds, and then when he's in those other worlds, he brings those back to the art world, and that goes back to this idea of critiquing design and what design can be. That's why you're rooted in design, maybe, is because you can use that as your home base to kind of go between these other worlds. I want to ask you about something that I know you don't really want to talk about, but I'm thinking about it while we're talking. The terms speculative design, critical design, which you've been associated with for better and for worse for your career, do not appear in Not Here, Not Now at all. I took the PDF, I did a find. That term, speculative design, critical design, does not appear at all in the book. In a 2019 interview, Tony, you said, "These days I'm a little wary of using labels, which, although helpful in the early days, mainly to focus the discussion, eventually hold back new ideas and thinking. I prefer to think more broadly about critical forms of design practice or speculative forms of design practice. They allow more room for different approaches and new ideas to emerge." This sounds like what you're talking about right now, that a lot of these structures are these sort of self-imposed limitations. I'm wondering if you are willing, could you talk about some of these limitations that you've grown to find around terms like speculative design and critical design, why those no longer feel like they maybe fit the work that you're doing? And again, from your practice, I'm not asking you to make a judgment over those terms.
I mean, I think that quote still captures what we feel about it. I think these terms are very useful in the beginning because people need to know what it is you're trying to do. They need to be able to criticize it, critique it, build on it, challenge it. But as it maybe becomes more accepted, they kind of solidify, and critical design becomes a certain, very specific type of design where even the criticality can start to fade away. And likewise with speculative design, people can recognize, oh, that's a speculative design project. But the kind of interesting thing about speculative thought might not even be in that project. So I think it's just really trying to say, well, we're still committed to the ideas of criticality and speculation, but trying to explore them in a much looser environment where they can continue to evolve, not just in our own direction.
We must have said it because we said speculative thought. So speculative.
Yeah,
Speculative appears,
design,
but not
yeah.
speculative design. Yeah.
I think that's important because in some ways we still believe in speculative thought.
Yeah.
That's the thing that it's not necessarily that it's a kind of label that you apply to something and put in a box and make a category.
And in a way, it served its purpose. It was useful at the beginning. People could, as I said, kind of articulate different versions of it. But now there are so many different manifestations of it in different contexts. That, on the other hand, it's also hard to say, well, what is speculative design? Is it what they do in a policy-making lab in a government or in the futures department in a corporation or in a tiny experimental studio somewhere? And so I think in that sense, the label just doesn't matter anymore. It's much more important that people are doing it.
How it's doing.
doing it in very different ways in different contexts and expanding design practice. And criticality, again, happening in all sorts of different ways too.
I mean, I'm also kind of thinking about the inverse, that once you start to label something, it separates it out as its own thing. And to me, that gets me thinking, well, isn't all design speculation?
Yeah.
Isn't all design critical? Do we need
Yeah.
to actually separate can these all just fold back in to this big umbrella of design? This is what you were talking about, a moment ago.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think so. I think at the beginning, like we started in the 90s and in a kind of interaction technology space, and techno utopia was full on force then. So the idea to challenge that and say, well, maybe there are, yeah, I mean, I know people are challenging it in philosophy and other fields, but in our kind of field of interaction design, to challenge it was quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so naming it and trying to work out why and how and what was really essential. But I think today, I'd agree with you. Like someone should be able to say they're doing one project, it's all about problem solving. They're trying to, apply those kind of more standard ways of designing, but they might shift to another project and use more speculative approaches or take a more critical stance on another project. It isn't like a permanent identity that someone needs to adopt.
Yes. Yeah.
Identity. I think it's like a tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, an attitude and so all we've tried to do is say, well, yes, we've got all these amazing approaches in design. Can we expand it a little bit?
Yeah.
And let these make some room for more speculative and critical approaches, which,
I love
I'm talking about our narrow field in architecture that's been there for hundreds of years.
Right.
I think graphics, there's a long tradition of it.
But the designer always thinks of things that don't exist. I mean, that's their
right.
role.
Exactly.
That's what they do. It's just that the things that don't exist that they bring in they could expand the pool of things and be more diverse about the thing. So in some ways, that's always been the case.
Yeah, for in industrial design, for example, there's been concept cars since the beginning, but they're speculative, but they're there to try and sell a certain dream about transport and a lifestyle and so on. And I think in the early days, we would talk about, well, it's there and designers do it. Can we repurpose it for more socially useful or more intellectually interesting purposes rather than it only being used to kind of instill dreams and fantasies in the consumer imagination.
So then that thing of sort of giving permission to a very disciplined academic who won't do anything speculative, but could do it secretly in a little pocket of academia, is liberating.
Right. It's opening up what is possible. Like that's the answer to everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like we ran a class with Janet Reutman for PhD students. It was a Mellon-funded initiative. And one of the students was doing economics. And they developed a kind of design fiction, I guess, around what would happen. This was about 5 or 6 years ago. What would happen if the dollar collapsed? And they looked at different currencies around the world. And we just heard about a year ago that they had finally presented it as a paper in an economics conference.
Oh, that's nice.
Story had to go through many, many iterations to get integrated into the kind of discourse that would allow it to be introduced into a fairly hardcore economics conference. And so those kinds of things are interesting too for us.
So that side is really, for us, it's very exciting. That's speculative thought is,
Let me, I have like 2 more questions basically.
Yes.
And I kind of want to ask you the opposite of what I just asked you. And so if that question was about kind of how these terms have changed or your relationship to them have changed, I'm interested in how the wider world has changed these terms maybe, or changed how we think about these terms. And the reason I ask that is you mentioned kind of getting started in the 90s, techno-utopianism. I just interviewed your former student, Nick Foster, about his new book. And he talked about kind of the feeling at the RCA that, all this new technology was sort of making everything possible. There was a very utopian view. And you both were interested in this technology, but you also you kept a critical distance. You wanted to explore these. In Hertzian Tales, you kind of critique this idea of user friendliness, of reducing the gap between person and machine. That maybe this is a not not the best way to do these interactions. And I'm so interested in how, in many ways, design has kind of even more fully gone down that route. So much of the design world has been kind of co-opted by Silicon Valley, user-centered design, transparent design, all of this stuff. But then on the other side, there is a greater consciousness that maybe this is bad. Maybe all those people in Silicon Valley aren't looking out for us. Maybe having access to all this stuff, there's side effects. Can you just sort of tell me about how you're thinking about this moment as it relates to the type of work you're doing, where in some ways design has become more monoculture, more of all this stuff you were critiquing 30 years ago, and how we start to connect that to those critiques and I'm not sure what my question is, but can you just kind of walk me through how you're thinking about that?
Oh, it's complicated because it's been a part of our lives for so long.
Right.
But I think it is fair to say that the kind of realities we're experiencing now are worse than any dystopia we could imagine.
Yeah.
We were trying to do dark dystopian critiques of technology in the 90s and 2000s. I think the interesting shift is, as you say, design maybe generally is maybe not so critical, but outside of design, criticality has gone mainstream.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference
That's
for
right.
us. So things that for us might have been marginal in design during that period are now, you can have those conversations with people in all sorts of fields. And it's just this, yes, it's obvious. Even non-designers, even people just in ordinary life will see these things. And I think that's the kind of thing we struggle again with, is that design itself, there just needs to be more criticality in that field. But I think, it's not going to happen in the companies. So you need spaces where that criticality can happen and be in dialogue with people working in industry. And again, I see that's another role for design academia, is to offer these counterpoints and then enter into dialogue through, whether it's directly or through exhibitions, or you put stuff out there into the world. So I think, I hope maybe that becomes more possible, or more, now in the new reality.
But I do think that it's a strategic way of thinking about it, because of the project we did with the Japanese company.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to talk about that, but finding, I mean, in the end, they were looking at how they might kind of had to critique by kind of educational means through employees.
Changing mindset.
So rather than doing a project, conceptual project, it's a project where employees come and try and stretch their minds, not go into academia, or just come and do a session where they're thinking about wellness, and they're doing products about wellness. But and again, how do you step outside of their usual ways of thinking? How do we get them to a different space? And it's quite interesting. They started off incredibly straightforward, generic, and by the end they were kind of quite, not wild, but really quite imaginative and skillful, in terms of the narratives that they were creating were very layered and conceptual and really smart and interesting. But so I think that I'm drifting, but so I think that the conversation, how to broaden conversations within an industrial context as well. Where do those things happen? And again, still tools need to be made to sort of open up and loosen up everyone. What was interesting, they wanted to do it with not just the designers, but a whole team of people who they work with, in order to kind of have better communications between people, and using that as a sort of a mode of opening up possibilities rather than closing down. So I think there's multiple little pockets of space. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? Well, I think that this kind of work it's got a very thin skin, and it's very small, and it goes very wide, and it goes into pockets of spaces where it kind of really resonates and really kind of works really well.
But I think what we're also seeing in our classes, just jumping a little bit, is students coming from many other countries and cultures and histories. wanting to take advantage of the classes to bring their philosophical traditions to bear on technology. So rather than saying, "Oh, we've come here to, learn a kind of a generic way," they see them as spaces to say, "Okay, we want to think about AI, but we want to think about it through a Chinese philosophical lens or something like that." And that's really interesting too, seeing different models rising up, different kind of. Yeah, I think we're not right now because these are very young students and recent graduates, but I think in 10 years' time, we're going to see some really interesting counterpoints.
I think that's right.
The collapse of Western technology and its dystopian values that are driving it. We're going to see other kinds driven by very different values.
I think that's exactly right. And speaking of this existing in pockets, thinking of getting outside of your reality, getting outside of the way you normally work. You just announced that you're leaving the new school. You're moving back to London. You're going to be you're going to focus on your independent practice and kind of teach in a variety of places, do a bunch of different projects. How do you this will be the first time I think in your careers that you're not fully embedded in an institution. Is that right?
No.
No.
Well, like since you've gone into academia, have you
ever since we came back from Japan in the 90s,
early 90s.
We've had a connection to academia, but you'd call it an adjunct.
Okay,
Be one day a week or whatever.
Studio.
And you'd run, but it's different there. You might be one day a week, but you run a kind of a lab that's very focused on specific issues. And we had a studio at the same time, often working with industry partners. But when I became the head of design interactions around 2005, I think that's when we really shifted our focus into the academic world.
Still running the studio, so we had the studio, and until I went to Vienna, and then we were still running the studio. So it wasn't actually till we came to New York, to be honest, that the last 10 years we've been kind of fully engaged more in academia than we've ever been. And I think we're really missing the practice side of our work and not getting back to a studio culture again. And I think so we're quite excited about giving more time to projects, because obviously you can see in the book we've got tons of projects and there's no time to really explore them enough or develop them enough. And I think there's a lot of and we've still got more. We've got a new project we want to start, which where we want to make a lot of things, and making in New York is very hard. Things we can draw and we can model and we can do that, but to make 3D things,
the economics just don't work.
Economics don't work here, so we're kind of missing that side, to be honest.
But I think we still want to stay involved with education, but maybe more project driven, where we work with different partners, the students join a project or so. But we'll see. We have to see what happens.
We're doing visiting roles.
So this is to use the word of the conversation, everything is possible right now, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think plugging into this kind of pocket thing, in some ways, it's been really good for the book to actually, really amazing to have the opportunity to be at the new school and be within this academic framework, to have the space to make this book. I think that it would be hard to do it. It would have been hard to do it in London, maybe, because we'd be too distracted by, too many we'd be making stuff and doing a lot more stuff. So I think, so that's been a brilliant thing. So we want to follow through with that, with more sort of practice-based work, and bring some of these ideas into material form, make some of the pieces. So
I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation. Congratulations on the new book. As I told you before we started recording, your work has been in my life for a long time and has been an influence on me. And so it's really nice to talk to you about how your own thinking about this work and your career has evolved over the last 10 or 15 years. So thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for being on the show.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you for your, they were genuinely thought-provoking questions.
And that was my conversation with Anthony Dunne and Fiona Raby. Their new book is called Not Here, Not Now. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us on Substack and get some bonus content every month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast. You can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.